Kennth Ausubel is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and entrepreneur. In 1990, he founded the Bioneers Conference, which brings together social activists and scientific pioneers to focus on environmental solutions to heal the earth. He's also producer and creator of the radio series Bioneers Revolution from the Heart of Nature. Kennth Ausubel spoke in Taos, New Mexico on June 23, 2004 on Bioneers Healing the Earth. This program is recorded by Cultural Energy. Visit culturalenergy.org or listen online to help create media voices for youth, arts, and activism in northern New Mexico.
What ecology really is it's the superb art of relationships. When you look at how we've been operating, we've been counting things and measuring, but what we really ought to be doing is mapping relationships. And women understand this, by the way, very easily. Men are beginning to understand it. But anyway, just to give you an illustration of that, Dan Daggett is a man who does a lot of rangeland restoration. He had actually been with the Sierra Club for many, many years and had been in a very oppositional kind of a framework of battling the bad guys, the environmental bad guys. And it was all about winning, and winning this battle and stopping XYZ from happening. And as he learned more and more about ecology and understood that ecology was the art of relationships, he began to question the way he was going about things, that whether this oppositional, warlike approach was really the right way to go. And so he instead said, maybe I should be reading books about relationships or wondering about what's kept my wife and me together for the last 26 years. And so he was dealing with a lot of rangeland issues at that time. And as all of us in New Mexico know, there have literally been bullets flying in the national forest here because environmentalists want to keep cows out of public lands and national forests. And, it's a pitched battle between the ranchers and the enviros, basically. Very bad situation. So Dan decided to go back to the art of relationships and started to read a lot about the prairie and the Great Plains. And, of course, that ecology, which is a grassland ecology, was co-created really by the buffalo. And the buffalo were a critical part of those grasslands, which in turn, that whole set of relationships actually created the weather that also supported that ecology. And the essence was that these were nomadic animals that migrated over long distances in very definite cycles. And as hooved animals, as ungulates, they churned up the soil, which helped the seeds, and they fertilized it, and on, a whole set of relationships. So Dan said, what if we were to go, and this created the richest land, some of the richest land on the planet, actually, the Great Plains, incredibly fertile area, the former breadbasket. So Dan said, what if we tried to recreate those relationships, right? What would happen? And we don't have buffalo anymore. What we have now are cows, the poster child of environmental destruction, no less. So he decided if he was going to do this, he needed to pick the worst place he could possibly find. He wanted the biggest challenge because then if he could do it there, he could do it anywhere, right? So he picked an abandoned gold mine in Nevada, right, which it looks like the moon. I mean, it was a lunarscape. There wasn't soil, much less dirt. I mean, it was talcum powder, basically. And in fact, when the wind blew, people in town would talk about eating tailings tacos. I mean, it was seriously bad. So he decided to run his experiment there. And of course, this being Nevada, immediately everybody started placing bets on his on his imminent failure. So what they did is the company that had been there had abandoned the site, of course. They'd made a feeble effort at restoration where they threw a bunch of seeds out, covered it with some hay, watered it briefly, and of course nothing happened, and so they walked and said, we tried, goodbye. So what Dan did is he did the same thing. He broadcast a bunch of seed, he threw hay on it, and then he took alfalfa, which for cows is like chocolate ice cream, and he sprinkled it up and down these very steep slopes, which forced the animals to move up and down, thereby creating terraces, right, which slowed down the migration of the water. Because there are no wolves and coyotes anymore, which partly kept the buffalo moving, they used electric fences. And it's a technique called move 'em and mob 'em, where you keep the animals in one place for a very set period of time, not too long, not too short, and then you move them again so that they never have a chance to overly impact one single area. And the cows started to poop and pee and fertilize the whole thing. Well, you can actually see the photographs, and it's quite extraordinary. 6 months later, there was grass that was literally chest high on what was a moonscape, all from restoring relationships. So then he took the really big leap. He decided to take it into the dreaded human realm. And he had the courage to organize a meeting of ranchers and environmentalists who had literally been shooting at each other, basically. And as everybody gathered very uneasily in this room, very, very tense, as you can imagine, he said this. He said, okay, everybody, we all come into this room, and we come in with two things. We come in with our opinions, and we come in with our values. And I propose to you that those are two different things. So I would like us for 1 minute to leave our opinions at the door, and let's talk about our values, right? And so they went around the circle, and sure enough, there was a common value, and it was the land. And these were all family ranchers. These were not corporate ranchers. That in many cases, their families had been on the land for generations. They were deeply connected to the land, just as the environmental folks were. And everybody realized that, and suddenly there was a common ground. And then Dan said, okay, now let's talk about better management practices. I want to talk to you about move them and mob them. And that they took off from there. Well, that movement is now spread throughout the West. There are many, many of these ranches and more every day, and they're flourishing. In many cases, because you see, the other problem here is that if the ranchers left the land, which is happening often when they go bankrupt, what comes in their place is the subdivision, as we all know, and nobody wants that. So these guys are now making a good living selling often things like wolf-friendly beef, because they have actually brought biodiversity back to these landscapes. In a couple cases, they've set up little B&Bs so people can come and bird watch and watch the animals and experience this whole amazing process that goes on. And Dan has a website, by the way, called Eco Results, that you can actually witness this in real time over a period of a season if you want to actually clock it. So that is what can happen from the art of restoring relationships. So, one other quick story, well, not a quick story, but one other story in this regard. The other issue, the elephant in the room with all of these conversations, as I say, it's not a technical problem. And behind most environmental harm is an economic motive, as a rule. And the elephant in the room is actually an 800-pound gorilla called corporations. And many of you, I'm sure, are highly aware of this, but most of the harm that's being done is highly organized at that level, and we live with a system where corporations have more rights than people do, quite literally, both legally and politically, and that's often what the struggle is. And so there are a couple of very, very interesting stories in that regard through the Bioneers Network. One is a woman named Diane Wilson. Diane is a fourth-generation shrimp boat captain on the Texas Gulf Coast. And for her, the bay, Lavaca Bay, there is like her grandmother. She grew up with it, and coming from a whole lineage of fisher people, and is very connected to that bay. It's a person for her. And so she was in the shrimp house one day. She's a high school graduate, a mother of 5, including her youngest, who's an autistic child. And she was head of the PTA. This was about 15 years ago. And one day in the shrimp house, this other shrimper comes in who was dying of cancer, and he had a copy of the Houston Chronicle. And he said, Diane, hey, have you seen this story? It turns out their little county, Calhoun County, population 15,000, was just named by the EPA as the most toxic county in the United States. And that kind of blew her mind. And she started to wonder if maybe that had something to do with all the dolphin die-offs and the alligators floating belly up in the bay, and the red tides and the brown tides and the green tides, and her autistic son. And so one thing led to another, and of course this is part of Cancer Alley, the infamous area of all the massive concentration of chemical industry plants. And so Diane decided to make some phone calls and ask some questions and organize some meetings. And when she organized the first meeting, she found that it was a lightning rod, because of course this whole area is a company town. And it's one company in particular, although there are several large ones there, but a company called Formosa Plastics. And it turned out that Formosa was planning a $1.5 billion expansion of their plant that produces PVC, polyvinyl chloride, one of the most absolutely the worst of the worst. It's part of what's called the dirty dozen. It has no redeeming value whatsoever. It's massively toxic. It's a gender bender, an endocrine disruptor that affects sexuality, birth defects, neurological, on and on and on. You name it, it does it. So the company actually, it was interesting because they were based in Taiwan, and the reason they'd come to Texas was they were so bad that they'd been kicked out of Taiwan. And in Taiwan, there is barely a square inch that isn't just pure pollution, and so you can imagine how bad that was over there. And in fact, Texas competed with Louisiana as to who could give them more money to come there. And in fact, the Texas people started accusing Diane of being a spy for Louisiana and trying to, get Formosa Plastics out of Texas. So Diane very quickly discovered that she was up against a big one here. She had this teeny little nonprofit. They were threatened, and as a result of that, her 6 board members all quit because they feared being sued. She had trouble getting a lawyer to work with her. Ultimately, despite having a high school education and a dislike of chemistry, she learned to file her own legal briefs and win cases. In fact, Formosa's own attorneys ended up calling her up because she knew more about the company than they did. And she began to win several rounds of this whole legal struggle to stop this expansion. At which point, the company decided to, they tried to ignore her, and finally she realized even winning these rounds wasn't going to really do the trick. So she'd been reading Gandhi and Thoreau and Joseph Campbell, and she was definitely deciding she was on a mythic journey at this point. So she went on her first hunger strike, and then went on 2 more up to 30 days long, to the point where she was actually in serious jeopardy of her life. And after the 3rd one, the company finally relented, came to the table, negotiated an agreement, and Diane thought that she was, on the path to victory when, of course, they reneged on the whole thing. And she realized that sometimes upholding the law means breaking the law, that she had to go further. And so she had heard through a lawyer in Houston about a technology called zero discharge, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's actually been on the federal books since the Clean Water Act about 20 years ago. It's mandated for companies because it was part of the effort to clean up our waterways in this country. And a zero discharge is very simple. It means it's a closed loop, that any poisons or pollutants have to stay within a factory's own loop. It's an off-the-shelf technology. It's not something we have to figure out. It's widely used in the Middle East because it also saves a lot of water. And so she was beginning to advocate for that. And she then got invited to Taiwan because many refugees had come to Texas, including from Vietnam, and they'd heard about her work against Formosa, and they invited her over there. So she arrived and was taken on this tour. Actually, it was a frightening situation because the environmental movement is literally illegal in Taiwan, and you can serve a very serious jail sentence if you're found advocating for any kind of environmental work. So she was basically taken undercover around the country, being shown the horrors that had been created there. And at one point, they took her to a treatment plant that Formosa Plastics had, which turned out to be a Potemkin village. It was literally a Hollywood set. And once you went inside the front door, there was absolutely nothing happening. It was just a facade, right? Well, that evening, they took her at midnight to a obviously unadvertised rally where there was something like 10,000 people who had come together. And part of the reason it was in honor of her being there, but they had also brought back the head of the environmental movement who had been living in Paris in exile. And he came back for this one event, smuggled into the country. He stood at the center of this sort of stadium area, and around him were concentric rings of people walking in opposite directions very slowly, the purpose being that they were there to take a bullet for him in case anybody tried to assassinate him. And in that moment, Diane realized the incredible courage that these people were exhibiting, and whatever drama and travail she had been through, that it was nothing compared to what was going on there and what's going on in many, many places in the world, in fact. And so she came back to Texas really renewed and revived and ready to, go at it one more time. So her case had worked all the way up through the EPA to the top level, right? And she decided to call and find out from the head official what was going on. And she knew that she was in good shape legally, and what was the delay? What's going on here? So she reached this woman official, and the woman mistook Diane Wilson for Diane, the name of the lawyer for Formosa Plastics. And says, hey, Diane, they've got you dead to rights on this, but even if you're convicted, we're not an enforcement agency at EPA. We don't actually have to do anything. So I don't think you have too much to worry about. Well, Diane just said, I think you've got the wrong Diane, click, and hung up, and knew that she had to do something very, very drastic if anything was going to change. So she did the most drastic thing she could think of. And if you're a shrimper, you can live in a decrepit old trailer, you can drive a pickup truck with 300,000 miles on it, but your shrimp boat, right, is your pride and joy. I mean, you take perfect care of that, and it's spick and span and beautiful. So she got her brother, the only person who would help her. She actually put out a reward for anyone who would help her, and none of the other shrimpers would help her, nobody in the community, nothing. But she wanted to take the engine out of her boat.
Kennth Ausubel spoke in Taos, New Mexico on June 23, 2004, on Bioneers Healing the Earth. This program is recorded by Cultural Energy. Visit culturalenergy.org or listen online to help create media voices for youth, arts, and activism in northern New Mexico.
What ecology really is it's the superb art of relationships. When you look at how we've been operating, we've been counting things and measuring, but what we really ought to be doing is mapping relationships. And women understand this, by the way, very easily. Men are beginning to understand it. But anyway, just to give you an illustration of that, Dan Daggett is a man who does a lot of rangeland restoration. He had actually been with the Sierra Club for many, many years and had been in a very oppositional kind of a framework of battling the bad guys, the environmental bad guys. And it was all about winning, and winning this battle and stopping XYZ from happening. And as he learned more and more about ecology and understood that ecology was the art of relationships, he began to question the way he was going about things, that whether this oppositional, warlike approach was really the right way to go. And so he instead said maybe.
Kennth Ausubel is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and entrepreneur. In 1990, he founded the Bioneers Conference, which brings together social activists and scientific pioneers to focus on environmental solutions to heal the earth. He's also producer and creator of the radio series Bioneers Revolution from the Heart of Nature.
I should be reading books about relationships or wondering about what's kept my wife and me together for the last 26 years. And so he was dealing with a lot of rangeland issues at that time. And as all of us in New Mexico know, there have literally been bullets flying in the national forest here because environmentalists want to keep cows out of public lands and national forests. And, it's a pitched battle between the ranchers and the enviros, basically. Very bad situation.